I still remember the day it started because it honestly felt so small at first. Just a white envelope taped crooked on my front door like some kind of passive-aggressive warning. But within a few weeks, it turned into the kind of neighborhood warn nobody in Oak Ridge Hollow saw coming, especially not her. The HOA president tried to shut down my guest house, the one my late father built with his own hands. So I turned it into the most embarrassing problem that entire community had ever faced, and none of it would have happened if she hadn't picked my property first. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I've lived in Oak Ridge Hollow for almost a decade. Quiet place, tree-lined streets, people who mostly keep to themselves and pretend not to notice each other, which is exactly why everything worked fine until Marla Jennings moved in and decided she wasn't just a resident, she was some kind of self-appointed authority over everyone else's life. At first, it was little things: trash bins left out 30 minutes too long, warning letter, mailbox paint slightly off HOA shade, another warning, someone's truck parked on the curb overnight after a late shift, fine issued like she was running a police department instead of a neighborhood association. Everybody complained in private. Nobody pushed back because that's how places like this usually work. People choose peace over confrontation. Until she got to me. It started on a Saturday morning. I was still half asleep, coffee not even made yet, when I opened the door and saw her standing there on my walkway, holding a clipboard like she was about to inspect a crime scene instead of a home. Crisp blouse, tight smile, eyes already scanning everything like she owned the place. "Mr. Mercer," she said, not even greeting me properly, just straight into it, "we've identified a violation on your property." I remember laughing a little because I genuinely thought she was joking. I mean, the guest house behind my main home had been there for 15 years, a two-story structure my father built after he retired, every permit approved, every inspection passed. It wasn't just legal, it was practically documented history in county records. So I told her, calmly, "You mean the legally permitted guest cottage?" And she didn't even blink, just flipped a page on her clipboard and said, "HOA bylaws prohibit secondary residences, regardless of county approval." That was the first moment I realized she wasn't confused. She was choosing to ignore reality. I asked her to show me the exact clause because I had read those bylaws myself when I bought the house. Every page, every amendment, there was nothing about banning guest structures, nothing even close, but she smiled like I was the one missing something obvious. "We interpret it differently," she said, and that word, interpret, told me everything I needed to know about how she operated. Within 3 days, I got the official notice, $2, $500 fine, immediate compliance required, and a threat of legal escalation if I didn't decommission the guest house. Decommission, like it was a broken machine instead of a living space my father built for family to stay in when they came to visit. That word alone made something in me shift from annoyance to something colder. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that letter over and over, hearing the ceiling fan, watching the light move across the wood grain, and thinking how strange it was that someone could just decide your history didn't matter because they felt powerful that week. That same afternoon, Marla came back. No appointment, no warning, just walked right up my driveway like she belonged there. And this time she wasn't alone. She had another board member with her, both of them standing in front of my guest house like judges inspecting a sentence. "This structure violates occupancy rules," she repeated, louder this time, like volume could replace law. I told her again, still trying to keep it civil, "It's not an occupancy violation, it's a permitted accessory dwelling." But she cut me off mid-sentence, waving her clipboard like a weapon. "The county doesn't govern HOA standards," she said, and I could actually feel my patience thinning right there in the sunlight. That's when I asked her one simple question: "Are you sure you want to escalate this when you're not even citing the bylaws correctly?" And I swear for a split second, I saw something flicker in her expression. Not doubt exactly, more like irritation that I wasn't folding the way everyone else did. She left that day without answering me, but I got the next letter 2 days later, same fine, now with added legal threats and a demand to cease all residential use immediately. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was scared, but because something about it didn't add up, like a puzzle missing a piece everyone else was pretending not to see. So I pulled out the HOA documents again, spread them across my table, and started reading slower this time, line by line, not looking for what she said was there, but for what she might have missed. And that's when I noticed something buried deep in the language, something she either didn't understand or hoped I would never read closely enough to find. And that was the moment everything started to change. If you want to see how a simple loophole turned into the biggest public humiliation Oak Ridge Hollow had ever witnessed, and how Marla Jennings went from neighborhood authority to the center of a community backlash she could never control, that night I didn't sleep at all. Not really. I just sat at my kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, staring at those HOA bylaws like they were suddenly speaking a language I had ignored for years. And the strange part is, the more I reread them, the less they felt like a weapon against me, and more like something Marla Jennings had never actually understood in the first place. Or maybe she understood it just enough to twist it, hoping nobody would push back. It was buried deep in Section 12, written in that dry legal tone that most people skim right past, something about accessory structures not being used for permanent independent residency under HOA governance. But then right after that, almost like an afterthought, it clearly stated that nothing in the bylaws restricted temporary humanitarian housing, emergency displacement accommodation, or nonprofit affiliated transitional use. And I remember just sitting there thinking how absurd it was. That the entire situation, all those fines, all that aggression, might have been built on someone either not reading carefully or assuming nobody else ever would. I wasn't angry at that moment. Not yet. It was more like a slow realization, the kind that creeps in quietly and then suddenly changes how you see everything, because this wasn't just about my guest house anymore. It was about the fact that someone in a position of authority had been enforcing rules that didn't actually say what she claimed they did. The next morning, I called a small nonprofit I had supported once or twice before. Nothing big, just a local group that helped families who lost housing suddenly, fire victims, people escaping unsafe situations, individuals who didn't have time to wait for bureaucracy to catch up with their lives. And I asked them something simple, almost casual at first, like I was still trying to convince myself this idea wasn't as serious as it was becoming. I asked if they ever partner with private homeowners for transitional emergency housing under county recognized guidelines. There was a pause on the phone, a long one, and then the woman on the other end said something I didn't expect. She said they had been looking for exactly that kind of arrangement, but never had enough stable locations to make it work consistently. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a loophole. It was an opportunity that actually mattered to real people beyond my driveway. Within days, things moved faster than I expected. Paperwork, background compliance checks, safety inspections coordinated through the nonprofit, documentation confirming that any occupancy under their program fell under charitable housing classification rather than residential tenancy. And every layer of it reinforced the same thing. This was legal, fully legal. Not an interpretation, not a gray area, but a structure recognized outside HOA jurisdiction entirely. I still remember standing in the driveway late one afternoon holding the wooden sign they delivered, simple, unpolished, almost too plain for how much weight it carried. Ridgewood Transitional Housing Initiative, Emergency Family Support Unit. And I didn't feel like I was making a statement at first. I felt like I was locking a door Marla didn't know could exist. I wasn't trying to provoke her. Honestly, I wasn't thinking about her at all in that moment. I was thinking about the idea that maybe this building could actually mean something useful again instead of just being a target for arguments. But of course, she saw it within a day. I heard her before I saw her, fast footsteps on the gravel, that sharp energy people have when they feel like something has crossed a line they personally drew in their head. And when I looked up, she was already standing there with another board member behind her, both of them staring at the sign like it had insulted them personally. She didn't even say hello. Just pointed at it and said, "You cannot reclassify this property to evade HOA enforcement," like she was reading from something rehearsed. I remember feeling strangely calm when I replied, because by then I already knew exactly what I was dealing with. So I just said, I didn't reclassify anything the nonprofit did under county guidelines. And for the first time I saw a crack in her certainty, not enough for her to stop, but enough to show she wasn't as unshakable as she acted. She tried to regain control immediately, shifting tone, talking about neighborhood standards, about precedent, about property values, but none of it sounded as solid anymore. It sounded like repetition, like she was leaning on phrases instead of facts. I told her again, still calm, that if she believed this violated HOA rule, she was welcome to cite the exact clause, And that was when the conversation shifted, because she didn't answer, she just stared at me for a second longer than comfortable, then said there would be consequences and walked away. 2 days later, another letter arrived, more aggressive than the last, demanding immediate cessation of what she now called non-conforming occupancy operations. But the irony was that by the time that letter reached my mailbox, the guest house already had its first occupants under the program, a mother and her teenage son who had lost their apartment after a kitchen fire, and a young couple trying to rebuild after an eviction that came out of nowhere. And I remember thinking how strange it was. That in Marla's world, this was a violation, but in the real world, it was just people trying to stay on their feet. And that's when the neighborhood started to notice, not all at once, but gradually, small conversations at mailboxes, longer glances when people drove by, questions that didn't sound like accusations anymore, but curiosity, because once there were real families inside that house, it stopped being an abstract dispute between me and the HOA and started becoming something visible, something human. A few days later, I received an email marked urgent, requesting an emergency HOA board meeting, and even though I already knew conflict was coming, I don't think I fully understood yet how quickly everything was about to shift once everyone was in the same room, because that meeting wasn't going to be about my guest house anymore. It was going to be about everything Marla Jennings had done before it. If you want to see how that meeting turned into the moment she completely lost control of Oak Ridge Hollow, I walked into that HOA meeting with a feeling I still can't fully describe. Not nervous exactly, not confident either, more like that quiet tension you get right before a storm breaks, when the air feels wrong, but nothing has happened yet. And the community center in Oak Ridge Hollow looked the same as always, cheap folding chairs, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a coffee pot in the corner that nobody really trusted, but that night it felt different, heavier somehow, like the room already knew what kind of night it was going to be. Marla Jennings was sitting at the front table with the other board members, perfectly composed on the outside, clipboard in front of her, papers stacked neatly, pen tapping in a rhythm that felt more like control than habit. But if you looked closely enough, you could see it wasn't the same confidence she used to have. It was tighter, more forced, like she was trying to hold a shape that kept slipping. When the meeting started, she went through the usual language, violations, compliance, community standards, property integrity, the same words she always used like they were enough to settle anything. But something had changed in the room, because people weren't nodding anymore. They were watching her differently, like they were hearing those words for the first time instead of just accepting them. The first real shift came when Doris Caldwell stood up, an older woman who had lived in Oak Ridge Hollow longer than most of the board combined. And she didn't even look angry. She just looked tired in a way that carried years of things left unsaid. And she reminded everyone about the fine she received last year for installing a wheelchair ramp that was deemed not HOA-approved color compliant, even though it was a medical necessity. And there was this pause after she spoke, not because people didn't believe her, but because everyone remembered it and nobody had said anything then. Then another neighbor followed, talking about warning notices for holiday decorations that were up too early, fines for trucks parked during work shifts, small things at first, but when they were spoken out loud one after another, they didn't feel small anymore. They felt like a pattern, and you could see people in the room slowly starting to realize they had all been carrying similar stories without ever connecting them. Marla tried to interrupt, saying these were unrelated enforcement actions, that the board had always acted within its authority. But her voice wasn't landing the same way anymore. It was getting absorbed into something bigger, something she couldn't redirect. And then a man in the back stood up, Carl Bennett, a retired veteran who usually kept to himself. And he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just asked one question that changed the entire direction of the night. He said, if the HOA is so focused on protecting this neighborhood, then why are we treating a temporary shelter for families like a threat? While nobody ever really explained where thousands of dollars in reserve funds went a couple of years ago. The room went silent in a way that felt different from before. Not respectful silence, but uncomfortable silence, the kind that happens when something everyone avoided finally gets spoken out loud. Then someone whispered the word audit, then another voice repeated it louder, and suddenly it wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a release, years of frustration breaking open all at once. Overlapping conversations, people turning in their seats, board members trying to regain order, but losing it with every second. Marla slammed her hand on the table and said this meeting would not turn into a baseless accusation session. But nobody was really listening to her anymore. Not in the way she expected, because authority only works when people still believe it has balance, and that balance was already gone. That's when I noticed something I wasn't prepared for, a woman sitting near the side wall holding a small child, and it took me a second to recognize them. They were staying in my guest house under the nonprofit program. Their apartment had burned down only a couple weeks earlier, and I hadn't even known they would be at this meeting. The woman stood up slowly, clearly not wanting attention, and she spoke about what the shelter had meant for them, not in dramatic language, just simple truth that it gave them stability when everything else collapsed. And then the little girl beside her, maybe 6 years old, holding a worn stuffed rabbit, stepped forward slightly and said in the softest voice, "Thank you for letting us stay there." And I swear the entire room changed in that moment. Because it stopped being about policies or enforcement or even conflict, it became real in a way nobody could ignore, and you could see it on faces around the room. People who had supported Marla out of habit, now realizing they were standing in something much more complicated than they thought. I looked at Marla then, and she wasn't speaking anymore. She wasn't arguing, she just looked frozen, like she had been pushing a system for so long she never considered what would happen if it pushed back all at once. The meeting didn't end formally. It just fell apart, people leaving conversations unfinished, others demanding financial transparency, board members trying to calm things down, but losing control of the narrative entirely. Within 3 weeks, Marla Jennings resigned as HOA president, and nobody tried to stop her, not because they hated her, but because the structure she depended on no longer held the same weight it used to. 6 months later, the bylaws were rewritten to limit board authority and require full public financial reporting. Changes that should have existed long before, but never did because nobody ever challenged the system hard enough. And my guest house is still there today, still part of that nonprofit program, still housing families when they need somewhere safe to land. And sometimes I think about how close it came to being shut down over something that wasn't even a violation in the first place, just someone deciding they had the right to say it was. So I guess the question I still sit with is simple. When power starts speaking louder than truth, how long do you wait before you finally stand up? And do you think most people would have done what I did, or would they have stayed quiet until it was too late?